This event is part of the London Festival of Architecture, and we are here to talk about legacies of colonialism in our public realm. For the Brixton Project, this is something that we've been working around now for about a year. We've been working with Guy's and St Thomas's Trust and Foundation, with the collections team, about 2 statues in their ownership, one of Thomas Guy and one of Robert Clayton. Thomas Guy is on the campus at King's College, and Robert Clayton is at St Thomas's Hospital. These 2 figures are actually people who founded, with their wealth, they founded the hospitals, and that wealth was accrued by their interactions with the trade in enslaved people and the wider transatlantic trade. So this is really, we've been working with them really to engage with the communities of Lambeth and Southwark around thoughts and feelings that people have, may not even know that they had, around the juxtaposition of these 2 characters in our public spaces at places of caregiving and health. So it's been an important conversation. It's one that is ongoing, and this is just another kind of step on that journey. So thank you very much for being with us tonight. I have an amazing roundtable of guests who are going to share their thoughts and expertise with us on a problem or a situation that is forever really very complex and will continue to be so. So we're all here to kind of try and work out what are the pathways forward, what should we be looking at, who should we be talking to. So we'll get to a point, and we really do want to hear from you. It's very important that we get your thoughts and feelings as well. So I'm going to start in the corner over here with Bell Ribeiro-Addy, who is our MP for Streatham. And thank you, because I know that you really rushed here, rushed to get here, and it's brilliant. So you were born and raised just up the hill on Brixton Hill, and anti-racist trades unions. I'm reading all of your touch points because I think it's important to this conversation, and you are calling for a wider discussion about reparations that move beyond the kind of initial idea that we might have. You founded the all-party parliamentary group to push aims for the wider reparations movement in Parliament, including formal apologies, debt forgiveness, restitution of stolen artefacts, environmental reparations, and decolonising education and overseas development aid. Wow, I think that deserves actually a round of applause in its own right. In April this year, she's become the 2nd MP to use Prime Minister's question time to ask the government to issue a formal apology for the transatlantic slave trade on behalf of the British state. Thank you for being here, that's really great. Zerritha. Zerritha is a cultural producer and arts leader with 20 years' experience in community and participatory arts. She's currently head of culture for Camden Council, having previously led culture at Brent Council for over 10 years. In 2022, you commissioned The Anchor, the Drum and the Ship, a public artwork in Gladstone Park, the first in the UK's history to acknowledge the contested heritage of a green space. Currently, you are overseeing diversity in the public realm artworks and memorials programme for Camden, which aims to represent the borough's statues and memorials. She is a member of the GLA Community Advisory Group for the UNESCO Remembering of the Transatlantic Slave Trade and its Abolition, and a member for the Museum of Docklands London Sugar and Slavery Experts Advisory Group. Thank you for being here. Kelly Foster is a public historian working both online and on-road, and is an open knowledge advocate. She's worked with community and independent archives in London for over 15 years, specialising in oral history and histories of library traditions of the African diaspora. You are a founding member of Transmission, a collective of archivists and historians of African descent, and is the UK coordinator for Whose Archives and Knowledge Justice campaign Whose Knowledge. You're also part of the Lambeth United report alongside Jon Newman, who is the general manager of the Lambeth Archives that is about to reopen very excitingly. Is that too? Yeah.
Don't hold your breath.
We all did hold our breath. Soon, anyway, it has been repositioned to Brixton Hill. And you've been there for some time, Jon. I don't want, many years, but anyway. And for many years, you have spent time exploring some of the colonial legacy issues around the earliest black populations in Lambeth. And your book, Windrush Forebears, revealed a small but significant population of young black, mostly male servants and former slaves living in Lambeth in the 18th and 19th centuries. So, and then finally, are we coming here to Councillor Sonia Winifred? And you. Is a member of the Federation, is a Lambeth local councillor, and between 2018 and 2022, she was cabinet member for equalities and the culture portfolio. Again, another author of the Lambeth United report. I feel there's a person missing here. Very important person. Linett Kamala, who's about to go away, so it's really brilliant that she's managed to be here tonight with us. Interdisciplinary artist, educator, currently project manager for the GLA's new memorial to the victims of the transatlantic slave trade, project producer for Brent Council, Untold Stories, and very, very much brought to life the anchor, the ship, and the drum with some serious months of hard graft in all senses. So we have a really very esteemed panel to set us off tonight, and we are in what was known as the Tate Library. So in itself, the name of this space has its roots deeply in Lambeth's colonial history and connections. We are on a square that has been renamed Windrush Square, and we are sitting behind, or in very close proximity, to a bust of Henry Tate that has recently been adorned with green paint. So if that isn't enough to get us going, I don't quite know what is. So the questions that I'm going to kind of start off with tonight are really, this is an extremely, we're at a point in time which is an extremely knotty one. So, we know that our public realm has to change. It has to reflect the beauty of our difference, and it has to reflect that in a very fulsome way. Currently, it's not doing that, and there are all sorts of constraints that are preventing us from doing what we might want to do, which is rip things down, throw them in the river like we did in Bristol. But the work that we've done over the past year does really recognise that for lots of people, once you sort of drop yourself below the kind of immediate emotive desire to get rid of something, there is a wider story to be told, and that wider story is significantly important. So I kind of want to go, I think, first of all to Zerritha, really in how do we do that? How do we balance this kind of emotive desire to get rid, and it's a really important emotion to acknowledge and to sit with. But how do we work with that, and at the same time, actually look at the backstory, look at what needs to be filled in, and how are we going to do that? How do we balance those things?
Hello, can you hear me? That's a really difficult question to start
Sorry.
with. Thank you. I mean, I guess I can come from a place of doing it, of the work that I did at Brent and the work that we're undertaking in Camden. And I think the answer that lies with both of those is having a conversation. It's really opening up that dialogue for a wider conversation. I think when Brent first approached this, and obviously for those of you who know Gladstone and Gladstone Park, and John Gladstone and his relationship to the transatlantic slave trade as being one of the second biggest traders, this was starting to come up much more within Brent, but I think the first sort of original consultation that the council did with communities, and because of who Gladstone was, it attracted a lot of attention, but a lot of people didn't want to change the name, and that was really on both sides. And then I was approached to think about how do we really readdress this through a cultural lens. So how do we, if we're not going to change the name, how do we look at this through using artistic practice? And one of the first people I picked up the phone to speak to about this was Linett, to say, Linett, how do we open up this conversation? How do we hold space for this? And particularly for me, it was quite a bit of it was quite a heavy subject to hold as Caribbean ancestry, who will have links to the transatlantic slave trade, but also being a member of the council that's been tasked with doing this work. But for me, it was really important to create a space where we opened up a dialogue, both on the negative and the positive. And it was really interesting hearing from both sides of the table, what people thought and what they felt. And we all got to a place eventually where people were saying, if we were to change the name, there was a real risk of losing the history. A lot of people we spoke to didn't even know about Gladstone. It's a part that people were very familiar with. They'd gone and they'd played football their whole lives there. They'd had picnics there. And when we approached this subject and they realised, they had to sit in that uncomfortable space. And immediately there was going to be an emotive reaction. But through lots of open dialogue with them, we got to a space where we found a way to look at how we might tell this story through a different lens.
Okay, I mean, you said something really important to me, and I think it's probably our key finding, that it's actually the conversation that is significantly important, and being in the conversation and keeping that conversation going. So having the output of you've got to make something, that was your particular problem. I've got to make something, I've got to get something made. But it's the dialogue that reveals kind of the deeper feelings, and actually at some point will produce a path. I'm going to pop in now to Sonia, Jon and Kelly around Lambeth United and the report that you did. I think I'll start with Kelly. What do you want to see happen now following that report?
So what always strikes me in thinking about the statuary, in particular in Lambeth, is how little we do know about it. There's it feels as though there's plenty of assumptions about the histories of those objects that are in the built environment, how they got to be there, how they were commissioned. And even though there's been fantastic research done by the archives team at Lambeth over the past 3 years in particular, I'm always reflective of what we don't know. And then also reflective of how we think about the ways that the statues in the landscape that we commute through, that we shop around, that we go to hospital with, whether we actually take time to think about how these objects in the landscape make us feel. These grand, vast, larger, 2 times larger than life-size, heavy metal, marble statues that are making these enormous statements about power and about permanence that I think, as somebody who moves through that space as just a regular person, sometimes we don't always have space to reflect on how those statues make us feel. And just to conclude, I think it's important that, we get here after a few thousand years of humanity creating these monuments and creating monuments in a particular way and out of particular materials in order to communicate things about power, in order to communicate things about the person that commissioned or made those objects. So it's not only about the history and the past of the biography of the person who's represented in those statuaries, in the kind of heritage landscape, but also about those objects and about what is the status quo, I guess, that those objects are upholding.
Thank you very much. That was kind of, I'm going to go to Bell, nodding sagely, and I think all conversation about power and what monumentation actually represents for us. I'd love to hear from you on what your thoughts are.
I mean, I think it's very clear that when we put a statue up of somebody or we name a road after them or anything like that, we're glorifying them. So the idea that if we were to remove such a thing, we were simply just erasing history doesn't really sit well with me, because there are many other things that you could do. So, for example, every time there's a Jubilee, and we have had a few of those, and they've renamed something after Queen Elizabeth, they've always put a little plaque underneath it explaining that it used to be called X, Y, or Z. And one of the things that many people don't know is that the subject matter to receive the most signatures for a parliamentary petition over about 4 or 5 different petitions was actually to have Black history taught in schools. And that wasn't obviously just many children asking for that. That was many British adults asking for that, Black and white. People clearly want to be educated. And the one thing about the tearing down of the Edward Colston statue, whether you thought it was right or not, is that it educated people about something that people had no idea of. And if we are to think and just clearly understand that when we put these statues, monuments, name things after people, we are glorifying them. If we remove them, as long as we are explaining why we have done so, we are educating people and educating people on the subject matter that it's very clear that the rest of the country actually wants to hear about. And that's one of the things we're asking for as part of reparative justice, educating people on what has gone wrong. I would like to see things changed because of that glorification, but I'd also like to see them very clearly explained so that people understand why. And I think the resistance to it is strange because, do you know, they pulled down, they had a statue somewhere of Jimmy Savile, and they've had other things. So, you know, obviously what Jimmy Savile did was awful. What the slavers did was awful. And to say that one should be completely erased, not even with an explanation, and the other, oh gosh, that would be just erasing history, just points to the racism that we continue to see in our society, because the ills that have happened to Black people never ever seem to mean as much.
Thank you very much. It's a weird thing to say, but I'm actually delighted that you brought up Jimmy Savile, because we have used this tirelessly as an example in our conversations with people that, you know, a statue of Jimmy Savile would just kind of not be on. There would be no conversation. And yet here we are having a very, very long conversation about these other characters. So thank you for bringing that to the table. Sonia, I want to bring you in now as one of the instigators, I think, of the Lambeth United report and the work in Lambeth. I know that you believe very strongly how this community is represented and feeling that it's not particularly well represented at the moment. What do you want to see happen as the result of that Lambeth United report?
Well, if I can say that this is a conversation that's been had for years, and it really came to the fore when we saw the killing of George Floyd on the 25th of May 2020, where Black Lives Matter really led the movement in this conversation. We saw protests across the world, and what we saw was people of all colour coming together to protest against this heinous crime. And Black Lives Matter then made demands on governments, local authorities, organisations to put their house in order, to look at those statues and monuments with links to slavery and colonialism. So in Lambeth, we launched an audit into our statues, monuments, street names, and hence the report. But that said, it's what was interesting, what I enjoyed and still enjoy having this conversation, because we need to have this conversation, is the volume of people who participated in this conversation. Not all like-minded people. People had their views, and I think some of the panelists have mentioned already. But it was during the COVID that we had this consultation. So it was online. So we had a meeting online. Over 1,000 people logged into this conversation, including members of the mayor's team, the mayor had launched the diversity in the public realm. I think, Binky, you were part of that, the committee.
I am a commissioner.
Okay.
I've got a Brixton Project hat on, but I've got that hat on.
Right, okay, so this came about. So we had the mayor's people there at this meeting, but it was the sheer volume of people in the consultation, and that people in the community wanted to have their say on what does it mean? And our younger people, which is really who we should be discussing here, because the future, what does this legacy look to them? Does it have to be a statue? What form will it take? So there's lots of questions to be asked. And people, our young people, all of us want to see ourselves reflected in our environment. We want to see proof. We want to see that we belong, that we are part of the society. So I think it's a conversation that's been going for so many years, and it'll continue. What I would like to see, back to your question, is a government that takes this seriously rather than working against the community. And we know since so many other authorities have followed and had this audit into statues and monuments with links to slavery and colonialism. The government has since passed the police crime and sentencing bill, where you find that it's to deface a statue, you face a maximum of 10 years in prison. I remember David Lammy questioning this because, you are technically, if you deface a statue, you're spending far longer in prison than if you commit a crime of rape. So we have to have a government that really wants to have a dialogue, wants to take things forward rather than working against communities. And we've since had the then generic, who was the Minister for Communities, and laws now change that make it more and more difficult if communities decide they want to remove statues, you now need to get planning permission. So I'd like to see government that really wants to work with communities to put history right. And this government has accused the community of wanting to rewrite history. No, we want history to be told. We want the facts. We want the truth. And someone's mentioned again, I think Bell, not too dissimilar to the British Museum's idea of retain and explain. So there's quite a lot to discuss around what does retain and explain means. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. That's great. I think to Linett now, because kind of what we're seeing, or what we're going to be seeing, is very much the job of artists to interpret this ongoing dialogue and follow its kind of twists and turns along the journey. And I know that's something that you've been doing, I think, since I first met you, probably 10 years ago, standing actually out there with a group of school children. So I'm very interested to understand the work that you're doing now for the Mayor's office. That would be really, I mean, I kind of know, but I want everybody else to know. And with particular reference to the kind of, the complexity of the journey for the anchor, the drum and the ship.
Yeah, I'll start first with the anchor, the drum, the ship. I'm also a descendant from those who were enslaved. And I think, first of all, for many of us, it's something that wasn't really discussed. And I think that's something that people need to appreciate and understand. There's a intergenerational different approaches to this. So for many, which I guess here people might refer to as the Windrush generation, it wasn't, and I'm just generalizing, of course, in other homes that may have been different, but for lots of people it wasn't something that was discussed. And so we came across this history in a way, almost, that image, that within a school setting. So that in itself was quite challenging when you think of all what was going on. And also, I just want to mention, many of us are the living legacy with our names. Let's not forget that our surnames. My surname I changed, actually, when I was in my early 20s, when I realised. But that's something, again, is a personal choice. So it's not some sort of static, sitting within a statue. We're talking about the nuances of people who are embodied, who walk around, whose passports, whose every single day your name is being called, and that's there. So I just wanted to kind of start with that. I think artists bring a really interesting approach. I think they are able to uncover sort of nuances. They work with materials in different ways. And so with the approach that we took, we thought about the landscape. And so it's a park. And as Zerritha mentioned, it's actually a much loved park. So when we did the community engagement, that's where the nuances came in. And it wasn't what maybe might have been an obvious response, which is we want the name changed, far from it. So many of the descendants were actually, this is our connected history. We are carrying the name still. So if you take away the name, people will never know necessarily in the future about that link. And that was really quite interesting. And then because it's a park, it brought about, and we were able to provide an artist brief which allowed that creativity for the artists to really think about the natural environment and what it can bring. And so some of the examples that came through, which were quite really interesting, was, talk around renewal, change, planting of seeds, generational, putting something into the ground, which actually in many generations to come, you might not see the end result. So it was all of these things which I thought was quite fascinating. And then we also had a history trail installed. So I just want to mention the artist was Haroon Morrison, and he worked closely with Antonia Collin, a horticulture specialist, to create that work. But we also had the history panel, which is alongside. And the history panel very clearly, again, it's not about an argument. Charmaine Simpson, who done that from the Black History Studies, it was very factual. And it told a story which none of us really knew. In fact, the family, the Gladstones themselves, you could say for some of them, it was new to them too, because until the UCL did that incredible work with the database, again, as surprising as it may seem, for some people, until their names were put into that database, they too did not have an idea of the depth or even the knowledge. So it was really a great way, as I said, to keep things relevant. We chose a particular footprint, so it's actually situated in the part of the park where Dollis Hill House, which is where William Gladstone used to visit. And went on a journey for people. So yes, we covered the history, we covered the transatlantic slave trade, the freedom fighters like Jack Gladstone I mentioned, but we actually bring it up to date, and it's still evolving. So we have an online resource where people can nominate as well. So we've actually kept it that way. And then just moving quickly onto the current project, which is the new memorial to the transatlantic slave trade, to the victims of transatlantic slave trade. The announcement's been quite new. The work is still currently in progress. But just to briefly explain where we're up to, there's been a lot of work done beforehand, and the location for the primary, shall we say, and I'm using that word carefully because actually there is like one spot where there will be a memorial, or again, it's quite open because an artist will interpret that, which will be outside of the London Museum of London at the Docklands. But what's really going to be fascinating are the satellite sites, which we are looking at, and it's just the beginning of uncovering these spaces across London, which have the link. And then lastly, education, which comes right back to the sort of work that I'm very passionate about. That's where the big, I think, growth and learning and embedding for generations comes in, because it's all very well, as I say, putting in something into the ground or putting up a statue or even taking it down. But how do you tell that narrative, this complex narrative? And I think that's a really great job for educationists to do and for us to think about.
Oh, thank you so much. That was, brilliant. Education is most definitely a thing, and how you tell the narrative is ongoing. It's an ongoing complexity, and I'm going to come back now to Jon. Thank you very much. Because in a sense, that's the task that you have. You have many, I know, as an archivist for Lambeth. But the way that history is changing and time is collapsing, and as Kelly said, there's what we know, and then there's so much more that we don't know coming through these things which have apparently been static and stuck away in bits of film in drawers and things like that. Tell us about your approach to that now.
Okay, thank you, Pinky. I work at Lambeth Archives, and after the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, I was approached and asked to do some work on the statues, memorials, and street names in Lambeth that may or may not have links back to the slave trade. And it was something that I'd already been previously quite interested in, and was happy to engage with. I think that the thing that struck me about the Black Lives Matter protest, and in particular the Colston statue in Bristol, but also the Rhodes Must Fall campaign in Oxford, which was a similar campaign, not like the Bristol one, that predated Black Lives Matter, actually probably harks back to the 2007 bicentenary of the abolition of slave trade that drove this kind of research interest in the history of the slave trade, and from which the UCL database came from, that incredibly important resource. What struck me about Black Lives Matter was that they were kind of taking an activist approach to historical research, and historical research as an archivist was something that I was always interested in, and Black history, and in particular the British history of the links with the slave trade were things that were both kind of underexplored and also kind of hugely interesting. So doing this piece of work specifically for Lambeth, I can't really speak beyond in any detail beyond the streets and statues of Lambeth. Can you hear me okay? One of the really kind of striking kind of general conclusions that we realized was the sheer embeddedness of the slave trade and slave-related industries as a significant form of investment for people with money in the 18th century, 17th century, 18th century, early 19th century. it was kind of endemic. It was where people put their money to get the best return. In the 1840s, it might be replaced by railways. In the 1890s, it might be replaced by oil. In the 21st century, it might be replaced by tech. But the slave trade, one way we need to look at the slave trade is that it was simply a kind of an investment opportunity. And as a result, huge numbers of people were enmeshed in it to different degrees of involvement. Yes, there were people like the vassals in Lambeth, Vassal Road, who, among other things, owned slaves in the Caribbean. There were quite innocent, in a sense, individuals like the trader scamps, nursery gardeners and museum collectors who wrote letters to merchant captains going to the Guinea shore, in other words, slave traders, to ask them to bring back specimens for their collection in South Lambeth. The Church of England was involved. Archbishop Juxon in Lambeth Palace in the 1660s. His family had clear connections with the Royal Africa Company, as did Henry Tulse, as did, of course, Robert Clayton. I think one of the challenges for any work around this is retaining a degree of nuance. And I don't mean this as some kind of pop-out. In a sense, Kelly made the point about these statues of kind of symbols of wealth and power, and indeed they are. And if we just take the example of Clayton and Guy, two actually quite different men, but both governors of St Thomas's Hospital, and Guy subsequently going on to found Guy's Hospital as a kind of adjunct to St Thomas's. These statues were not obviously being put up for their role in their ability to make wealth. These statues are a kind of they're an adjunct to power, but they're also a kind of a celebration of philanthropy. The Guy in particular devoted huge amounts of money to founding and funding a hospital. The fact that he made that money largely on the back of South Sea Company investments clouds the issue, but also doesn't necessarily detract from his philanthropy. So in all of this, it's complicated. I mean, I think he talked at the beginning about we might want to tear down statues, but and I'm interested in that but, and I'm interested in what that but means in the way that we go on to explore the kind of the full complexity of these individuals. If we are going to return these statues in some form, and I feel there is a very strong argument for retaining them. I think they are the evidence of the people that they personify. That they are in part the evidence of their evil as well as their good, and that's a kind of a messy, complicated mix that requires interpretation and requires kind of thought. I mean, it's quite easy to walk past a statue in central London and not think about it at all. It can easily become another piece of street furniture, like the traffic lights and the road signs and the pub signs that you pass every day. What Black Lives Matter did, and what the whole kind of Colston and the roads debate and all the subsequent kind of developments from that, what I think one of the things it's done is that it's made people look at historical objects in a new way and in a questioning way, and I think that's great. I think that's what people should do. I don't have a kind of a position on where we go from that, but I think that kind of that questioning needs to continue.
Thank you so much, Jon. I want us to have a really good discussion with the audience, so I think I'm going to attempt a little bit of summing up, so bear with me. Bell, I think what we were kind of getting from you in a very kind of clear sense is get rid and educate. That was unsubtle, but
definitely educate 100%.
Yeah.
Get rid, in some instances, as I said, statues are there to glorify. And I think about even the instances where we have placed other statues. So if you've ever been to Parliament Square on the Green, you'll see that there are all of these very, very large statues. Some of them are on extremely high plinths, but the ones that aren't, there are two that are not on the highest pedestals, and those are the ones of Nelson Mandela and Millicent Fawcett. They are very, very low down. And remember, these things are designed by men, and there's jokes about size mattering. They put those things quite high up because they think that you put something higher up and it's more glorified. So it's clear that these individuals, regardless of what they've done, are being praised. And when I say we should remove and educate, I think about the British Museum. I think about all the things they have in there. I think about all of the things that people want back in their countries of origin. And it is a British museum, and you're absolutely right. We should be educating people. So why would we not perhaps move the statues into the British Museum, and where they could use the space that they've given other people's things back to them, and that can serve as a place of education.
Brilliant. Okay.
It would be really interesting to see a hall of statues educating us on our slave trade with all of these people that were so enriched by it. I think it makes a massive difference. So yes, let's move, get rid. Maybe not so much. Let's move and educate. Yeah. Let's say that. Move it to an appropriate place.
As we say at work, we move. We move, and I think that's a really kind of very pragmatic and doable response. Kelly,
just to say, the British Museum currently has offered to lend some things back to other countries of origin. Their main thing is not removing their ownership, which is an issue in itself. That's another discussion, isn't it?
Well, yeah, hopefully the next discussion. It's not really. It's a continuum. Kelly.
So the reason I said, maybe it's not another discussion, it's part of one and the same. These statues are owned by entities, whether that's a local authority, whether that's English heritage, whether that's private ownership. And the law around ownership is seen as one of the main barriers towards the possibility of change, of whether that's removal, whether that's reappraisal, whether that's a metaphorical toppling, if not necessarily a literal toppling. So, I think the kind of the constraints, the legal constraints, I couldn't give you chapter and verse of the government's retain and explain requirements. But the legal constraints are an important thing to consider. Yeah. So, and an important thing to have activism and to be campaigning against. So Jon reminded us very usefully of the impact of the then Prime Minister's bicentenary of, Deputy Prime Minister, sorry. The Deputy Prime Minister's bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade and the impact that had. And I think it's important for us, especially this year, this is the 30th anniversary of the Abuja Declaration and the 30th anniversary of the Abuja Conference for Reparations. It's important for us to see the campaign for justice in law. And I think as we were just discussing, and as Sonia brought up as well, this is about justice in law and the possibilities for communities to have an input into actually what is the context, what is the environment that they want to live in. But also more broadly, what is the role for the toppling of these statues? And I use that whether it be metaphorically, whether that be intellectually, because I think truth-telling and being frank about how the built environment has been shaped in order to distort how we remember and what we forget. Those are all important things to be considering. I know that there are particular kind of political urgencies in wanting to see things be done, but in thinking about the kind of the age and the kind of how long some of these statues have been in place, I think it's important to have a kind of long-term view as to the possibilities of what change is possible. And then in and amongst our own education, our own educating ourselves, it's very tempting to see these as kind of the latest iteration of the of what's being called culture wars, or see these as campaigns that have only been active since 2020 and the murder of George Floyd. I think back to the campaigns of Lambeth councillors like Sharon Aiken and Linda Bellos, who in 1986 were pressing for the changing of street names, the renaming of street names, the reappraisal of our public realm. These aren't conversations that are new to people in Lambeth, the conversations that we're having is a continuation of the work that they were doing, and I think that's an important thing to remember as well.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna throw it open to you guys. We have an amazing selection of experts with very specific expertise that, I'd really like you to kind of come forward and with your questions. Who might have a question to start us off? Okay, thank you. Yeah. I think there's a microphone coming to you now.
Yes.
Please let us know your name if you want to.
Yeah, my name's Stephen Duncan. I'm a sculptor and I live and work in Brixton. And I've been involved with several public sculpture projects. I think the whole, that moment when the Coulston statue was thrown into the river was quite extraordinary. It was a very powerful statement that group of people made. There's a part of me as a sculptor that thought, that's a shame. It's a pretty good piece of sculpture there. And it made me think about how we do actually address the issue of possibly retaining some of these really well done pieces of sculpture that we might like to still keep in the city environment, the urban environment. I know there was quite a big row between people who wanted to keep that sculpture and those who really thought it should go. Simon Sharma, the historian, talked about, he was surprised it hadn't been thrown in the river quite some time ago. And I think that for artists, this is actually really quite a challenge to try and look at the issues of memorialization. Coulston statue was a memorial to a particular person. But as you brought up the issue of education and the future, we do need to see a statue like that in a new context, in this very important context of slavery and the history of slavery. And I think artists now have faced that challenge of actually what do we do? I mean, I know at one point there was this idea of turning that sculpture upside down as a way of showing the community's opinion of this person, which would actually be a very interesting thing to do, I think. So I think, I'd just like to open up this whole issue of how do we creatively make sure that new generation, the next generation, understands what that sculpture memorializes and how we actually memorialize it in a way that makes sense, that shows both what somebody like Coulston had done and what he, continually, there's this whole thing about patronage and the, how good Guys was in providing this hospital, how good Coulston was in benefacting the city. But how do we put these two things together? And that's a really important creative debate, which I think is absolutely vital.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That's really well put. I'm going to go firstly, I'm going to go to Linett as the artist with this dilemma, and I think it's about permanence, isn't it? And us kind of perhaps letting go of a notion that everything should be permanent in some way.
Yeah, so I'm wearing a few hats, but I also have an extensive history
within education in terms of school leadership. So, gosh, where to begin? I think we need to think about the context of, if we talk about education, whether it's the different settings where those young people are, the backgrounds of those young people, the dynamics are changing. And so when we did, for example, the consultation stage of the Anchor the Drum Ship, I went into the local school, which actually I used to be, in a different life, the head teacher of. So very different demographic of young people. Some of them, yes, direct descendants, you could say. Others, the majority, were not, and had no idea of this history because, as I said before, where is it taught and how is it taught? So there's that starting point in a way. And as someone who's coming from the lens of school leadership, because as I say, I keep going back to schools because it is very important. That's where the majority of young people spend most of their time. And we're picking up, so the educators, those in those positions, will be picking up, shall we say, leadership in terms of whether it's government leadership. And if the message is coming at the moment that it's not even necessarily acknowledged, there's the whole conversation around even an apology. Let's start at that. That's not happening. So then, let alone the educators being educated and then having the passion and the understanding and the confidence to deliver that. So it goes on many, many levels from the educational perspective. And with regards to wearing my artist hat again, there's many interpretations as an artist. And I think we just need to be, I would just say, we need to remember this is the artist's interpretation and it's their view. They are not going to be able to speak for everyone. That's impossible. And so even using words like community, what does that mean? So I find it fascinating. I find it exciting in terms of the possibilities with, for example, technology. These statues of things that we can do, and that there's some really great work happening, I know, particularly in Lambeth, around, augmented reality and using soundscapes and so forth, capturing stories. So there's lots of different ways, but I guess what I'm saying is there isn't obviously one approach, and we need to think as well about, even when we deliver and teach creatively or history or whatever, that perhaps how it's being done now is not just a case to replicate that, because I would argue clearly it's not having an impact if many of young people today don't even know this link in this. Let's take London. It's all around us, for goodness sake, but people don't know.
Thank you.
So there's a couple of things I just wanted to say off the back of that. Just going back to the British Museum. So so Camden Council launched our Windrush programme on the 4th of June, and we partnered with Linett. And at the beginning of the year, I spoke to the British Museum and said, "What are you doing for Windrush?" They said, "Oh, what are you doing? We really want to partner with Camden." And I said, "You know what I want to do? I want to bring a sound system into the British Museum," thinking that there's no way they're going to let that happen. A sound system, objects, And they said, "Yeah, we're up for it." So we worked with Linett to do that, and we bought a sound system in a couple of weeks ago. And it was just extra. I mean, one of the highlights for me was them running saying, "Got to turn down the bass because the objects are shaking." And I thought, yes, we've come in here and we've disrupted. It's payback. So I probably shouldn't have said that. But just in another way, just picking up on your thing around new technology. I mean, Camden Council have a strategy for diversity in the public realm. They, when all the local authorities were really looking at their statues and memorials, Camden very quickly got across party committees of members who then came up, who then basically agreed to create a strategy for diversity in the public realm. And out of that has come a commitment to re-look at all of our statues, which is about 70 statues and memorials. And you're right in that we don't own all of them. They're in loads of different control. They're different land ownership. Some are owned by the local authority, some are owned by some of the trusts and foundations. But we've made a commitment to look at how we reinterpret this And that is going to be a mixture of doing that through oral histories, archiving, and creating new artworks, which sit on a digital platform called the Camden People's Museum, which will be a living, breathing platform which we can keep adding to. But really important is that it doesn't feel like it's being driven by one person, it's being driven by collective voice, whether that is schools, whether that are community groups, whether that are the friends of, and there's a whole different conversation we can have about access to public space and who has access to public space and who feels they have ownership over public space. But this is a big piece of work and a big commitment that we've made. We're on the journey where we're looking at 3 statues and memorials at the moment, but the plan is over the next 5 years to look at how we address all of the statues within the borough.
I'm delighted to see that you have a kind of, you have a timeline. That's fantastic news. I'm going to come to Sonia. And if simply because you kind of, you were instrumental, I think, in Lambeth in getting this whole engine running. And we're sitting in a space which has this statue outside covered in green paint. What do you think should happen with that right now?
That's a good question. Yes, it is a very good question. If I can go back, when we began the audit on statues, monuments in Lambeth, I made a point of saying how proud I was of our community, because throughout the process, the bust of Henry Tate remained untouched. And I just felt, well, wow, because people were so engrossed in the conversation around statues. And I think, I'm not sure how long it's given this highlighter, but
I think it's just over the weekend. It's a very subtle highlight, though, isn't it? Really?
It is very subtle, but I think there's the whole question around Henry Tate. Are you asking me what do I think should happen to the bust of Henry Tate?
Well, I think it's unlikely that nothing will happen to it. Either somebody's going to try and clean it, although I would really prefer them to clean out the enormous plant pots around Windrush Square. That's another thing.
Well, that's another story.
That's another story. So somebody's either going to try and clean it, or something will happen. So what do we feel collectively should or could happen with that now?
Well, we could ask the audience what they think should happen, but I think it's part of this dialogue, this narrative that we've been having for so many years around Henry Tate and whether or not Henry Tate was part of this slave trade. I'm going to hand over to Jon in a minute because he's done some thorough research on Henry Tate and his involvement or not in the slave trade. But I think prior to Windrush Square, we know this was Tate Gardens, so the whole history of when it was handed over by Lady Tate to the then Mayor of Lambeth for the enjoyment of the community. And we know Windrush Square in 2009 for the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the Windrush. And we can see we now have the Black Cultural Archives. We now have the Cherry Gross Memorial, and not forgetting the West Indian ex-servicemen memorial as well. You've got the Sharpsville Massacre, you've got the memorial there. It's become a major, significant part of the borough for everyone. So I think if we're going to be focusing on Henry Tate, we have to go back into the history of where we are today, and I think that's part of the dialogue. And because you did that thorough research, John, I'm going to hand over to you, because what we did unearth is that Henry Tate was in fact very, very young, a 14-year-old, during the abolition of the slave trade. So I'll hand over.
I'm going to park that for 1 minute because we've got one audience question there from Ross, and then we'll come back to you, John.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Ross Griffiths, Chair of Friends of Windrush Square, and I must say I'm happy to be here. Couple of points. I do think we need to have a one-to-one about this ongoing dialogue, because I think that we talk about these issues as if they just started, and it didn't begin with conversation around George Floyd that was just recent. I recall burning of buildings. Things were done symbolically back in the 80s. There was lots of statements. There was a watershed moment. There were uprisings. There were resilience. I mean, I can go on. So this is not a new conversation, not for me anyway. But I think the next generation, that we need to move from miseducation to education. And we need to have that conversation, which is going to be a bit frosty. And it should be about being honest and straightforward about who's telling what story. Is it factual? Who benefits from, these monuments or whatever is put up? Because when I look around the borough that I grew up in, a lot of things are there because we've inherited it. It's just there. So we do need to have a conversation about its relevance now. So when we do reflect on our history, we look at where we're at now and where we want to be. I can talk about Windrush Square because 25 years ago, this year, we celebrate 25 years anniversary of the renaming of the square and the process that the community went through to call it Windrush Square. It wasn't an easy road, but it was named after the Windrush generation, and we are a long way off it living up to its illustrious name. But we are ready to have that conversation, but it's about who wants to be a part of that conversation, because I think there is a lesson to learn about people who felt displaced in this community to what they had to do to felt that they belong. So it was about the in-group pushing out the out-group and all sorts of things going on. So we could look back to look at where we're at now and going forward. So when we are talking about naming roads, monuments and all sorts, I think it's about what does that really mean? What is that really changing? What is the impact? Because, I don't think anyone's mentioned racism, because at the end of the day, when we look at the systemic racism, all of the issues that we experience is because of that systemic racism. Nobody is talking about how we can move to dismantle that. And until we're committed to that, we ain't changing much. Let's be frank and honest about it. So we really need to not wait for another incident where we're hopping mad and the next generation start tearing down statues and what have you, to think, well, that's their contribution to activism. That doesn't change anything. And I can tell you that from experience. We really need to look at the system that keeps racism, sexism, all these things going, and to have that honest conversation. So it is about who's going to have that ongoing dialogue, because it is ongoing and it is going to be difficult. And who's going to be in that space, particularly if you're talking to people who come from a place of trauma. Okay, so we've got to be mindful about having a conversation. You might want a conversation that you don't really want to have. So I believe that we should have that conversation, but it's about how that's managed. And the other thing is about the education. And education for me didn't start in the institutions, it started in my community. I got my PhD in this community and graduated. It was my elders that educated me to be a better version of myself, taught me about my history through Saturday schools and through putting in their time in the community. When I'm sitting next to the Great Dawn Hill, it's people like them that I stood on their shoulders listening to them, and many have gone on. And it's about the next generation understand the struggle, what they can do to move things forward. So when we talk about education, it's not about institutions and schools and universities. It is about how can we empower the community to involve others and collaborate and empower others to be great leaders. That's my point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ros. Thank you. I'm going to come back to Jon because she wanted to pick up on that. But I think important things have been said there about the nature of education and where that should be happening, and how we kind of get it out of institutions, because it has to sit in everybody's heart in a very different way.
Okay. After Roz's point, I feel that this is just a kind of a minor footnote, really. But the question of Tate and his involvement or not with the slave trade is an important one, because we're talking about a process here that is ultimately driven by accurate research and by historical facts. And Tate has often been kind of fingered for his involvement in Tate and Lyle's sugar company, and obviously by inevitably the company's historic links back to Caribbean and slave-produced sugar. But we need to remember that Tate was actually a teenager in 1833 with the abolition of slavery, and yes, he then went on to run a company that continued to use kind of indentured workers on the plantations, and of course he was working in a trade that owed its initial wealth to its basis in the slave trade. But if we're going to be precise about it, then Tate post-dates the slave trade and his involvement. That's been a very kind of uncertain position for people. I mean, if we look at what Tate Britain makes a very careful statement about recognising Tate's role within the sugar industry and the sugar industry's inevitable historical links back to the slave trade. But the reason that Tate Gardens was called Tate Gardens was because, I mean, I used that word earlier, philanthropy. This is about wealthy men and women at the end of their lives cleaning up their reputation. Everybody does it. Gates does it now. Bezos will do it. Slave traders did it. We need to kind of recognise why these buildings exist, without at the same time failing to recognise the generosity of wealthy individuals giving away money at the end of their lives. And it's not just Tate Library Brixton. There's Tate in South Lambeth, and there's Tate in Streatham. He actually gave 3 libraries to the present borough.
I think is actually happening right here, right now in this room. So thank you very much for that, because it is the fuller story and all the bits that we don't know that are important. Marsha.
Hello. Hi, I'm Marsha Lowe. I'm from Oxygen Arts, and we create projects that document Black British history, uncovered histories. And I'm really sorry. I think I'm going to take this back to Jimmy Savile, which is making me feel a little nauseous, but I'm just going to go there anyway. Because I think it's not just about the fact that the ease of which his statues were removed, but also the fact that before anyone knew about what he was doing, he was a noted philanthropist. And so a lot of the money he generated, in today's terms, I have no idea, millions of pounds to support Stoke Mandeville Hospital, yet no one cares because they know what he did. And I think there is something definitely about the double standard there. And I think it's because people don't really still, and we're going back to education in schools and in communities, don't really understand the horrors of the trade and how pervasive it was. I do remember going to Liverpool a few years ago, and this wasn't at the Slavery Museum, this was at the Liverpool Museum, I think it was called that. It was just a standard museum, and they literally had a film that said categorically from the start, this city was built on the blood of Africans. It really was that plain. And I don't think I've ever seen it in any museum in London expressed as cleanly as that, and as clearly as that. They acknowledged it. They went on to talk about what they achieved, but at the beginning, they acknowledged that we would not be where we are today were it not for the transatlantic slave trade. It's really that simple. And I think that until people have an understanding of that, and that's across the board, these long, drawn-out conversations, which might be great and interesting, but at the end of the day, shouldn't be necessary in the same way that the Savile conversation was not necessary. The statue just came down, right? And I'm quite interested in the idea of turning them upside down as well, because I think there is something about people understanding how pervasive it was and how much of the wealth we consider to be ours and that these newcomers are coming and taking is actually built on empire and built on colonialism and built on the robbery of nations around the world. I think a statue upside down is a really interesting way to have that conversation, because you might notice that more than a statue right way up, and then you might stop and look and see. Like, I'm not pedantic about ripping them all out and shoving them in a museum. I just think that the actual idea that we're having, we have to keep having these massive consultations about what we do with this one and what we do with this one is really quite, I would find it draining, simply, is what I'm saying.
In a sense, it's a continuation of the perennial problem. You know, we are still addressing the oppressor in some senses by having it as a consultation. So I hear you. Any other questions out there? We've got 10 more minutes. Okay.
Hi, my name's Catherine. I work at Lambeth Council. I just wanted to ask about Tulse Hill as an example of an area that has a lot of names. So Tulse Hill the ward isn't named Tulse Hill anymore, but the train station is, the road is, an estate there is. So I just wanted to ask about what you said, one of the panel said before, about it being so embedded, and how the complicated thing of unpicking these things that are everywhere and in lots of different public domains could happen, and whether you think it will happen like one by one with statues, or you mentioned Camden has a policy as well about in the public realm. Like, it's so big. How is the way people are going to approach things that are so embedded like that? And maybe thinking particularly about Tulse Hill as an example that comes to mind for me.
Thank you, Catherine. I think Kelly.
So I don't have an easy answer or an easy opinion about that. I just want to come back to something about Henry Tate, however, because I think it's, when we're thinking about precision and language and context, I think it's an important one. So the conversation around Henry Tate and Tate and Lyle tends to return back to the trafficking of enslaved Africans and the abolition of that trafficking in 1833, 1834. What it ignores is what came after, is the terror, the exploitation, the continual trafficking of people for another 100 years, and the systems of wage slavery that happened in the Caribbean on Tate and Lyle owned plantations. And Tate and Lyle were one of the biggest plantation owners in Jamaica, Guyana, or British Guiana, and Trinidad, really up until the 1930s, when there were major labor rebellions against the kind of really extreme oppression that sugar conglomerates like Tate and Lyle were responsible in the suppression of the laboring classes in the Caribbean at that time. So I think, as Marsha said, it's also about how do we expand our conversation. So yes, there has been a focus on the mechanisms and the royal, the chartered royal institutions of the South Sea Company, the Royal Africa Company, the Royal Guinea Company. But, how do we recognize the continuing exploitation that economic, psychic, physical exploitation that conglomerates are responsible for today? And I think this is particularly important as to not only kind of for residents in our kind of local communities, but also when we think and when we go through the landscape, the wealth that is in Westminster and in the City of London. This is the Architecture Festival. So, these statues are in a broader heritage landscape where the architecture itself is about elevating and uplifting and glorifying, as Bell said, the presence, the philanthropy, the benevolence of these, not only the individuals but also the institution itself. So when I say things like to topple intellectually, that could mean to put something upside down. That could mean to keep it in the river and not to move it into a gallery space, whether that be in a gallery space and it's laying on its side as opposed to being upright. How do we, quite frankly, continue the challenge and the kind of continue to challenge the the glorification that we give these objects. And oftentimes these are objects that are seen as art objects. And because they're art objects, they can't be changed, they can't be destroyed, they can't be melted down. And we have these ideas of permanence of these things. There is no such thing as permanence. Things are constantly being changed. New commissions are constantly being made and have been historically. If I walk through, what do you call it? The King's Campus if I walk through Guy's Hospital and I see the statue of Thomas Guy surrounded by iron railings in the middle of this very grand courtyard where he's at the epicenter of everything. It's not only the kind of statue and the artistic image of Thomas Guy that I'm seeing the whole landscape around it. So how do we really intellectually topple objects like that is a useful exercise for us to think about.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I think, Dawn, yes, please.
I just wanted to make a comment about Guy's and St. Thomas's hospitals, in that they're the richest hospitals in the country still, regardless of whatever you hear is going on. But the COVID has affected them equally. Guy's and St. Thomas now look after South London. It's the majority of the people they look after are Black, African, Caribbean, and a few other minorities from Latin America. I've been on their board. I was on their board for 8 years, and further to that as a governor, and I'm still at the Evelina, making sure that the Evelina Hospital School stays in Southwark. What about these two guys and Clayton? Coulston is his name, isn't it? People pass them every day, and they say they have no idea about them. But what I'm happy about is that Mary C. Cole, 10 feet, whatever she is now in Guy's and St. Thomas. And that took a lot of energy, a lot of my energy as well, to make sure I was on the board, and I was asked, Dawn, would you go on the board of Lord Soley to make sure that Mary C. Cole goes up? Nobody in Guy's and St. Thomas's knew about Mary C. Cole. So we had to have consultations, with wonderful people here tonight. Part of the consultation, we had Martin Jennings actually went to the Crimea, filmed the earth, came back. We had great times at King's as well. South London was educated. I made sure the consultation went on. What is the current problem at Guy's and St. Thomas is that the students that are coming in, the medical students, I'm actually reading a report. There's going to be a book about Guy's and St. Thomas's coming out soon. And I've been given a chapter to which I contributed to make sure it's correct. And in that chapter, there is a whole section about the medical students confused about who these people are. And because all they ever got told about is these wonderful people who built these hospitals and Kings, and this is all for you, and they're questioning, and that's an issue. So what I'm saying is, what do people get told when they start at Guy's and St. Thomas's? At least we could start educating the staff.
We have started to speak to the team that do the inductions to actually tell them more. So I think we're coming back again to the importance of education and to keep talking to people in all all these different scenarios beyond the school wall. And this is very much what this evening has been about. We have another one on Thursday evening. We have part 2. So if you are up for part 2, then please do come and join us at the department store, 6:30 on Thursday, 6:30 to 8. It's been fabulous to see you all here, and I'm really sorry that we have to kind of stop now. It's 8 o'clock. We are in a library where people just do not get paid to kind of hang out all evening with the door open, so we have to let them go home, and thank them very much for, being with us and bearing with us. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you to an amazing library team. Before you go, so that's Thursday downstairs at the department store. Tomorrow night at International House. In fact, all day tomorrow we have a fantastic happening, archiving the inner city at International House with our collaborators, York University sitting there, which is a fantastic look at Brixton and 2 other communities, one in Paris, one in Philadelphia. It's a project that's been going on for 3 years now. Please do come along if you can, 5 p.m. onwards at International House. We'd love to see you there. So it's going to be a very busy week. If this is your thing, please come and join us tomorrow and on Thursday. But that's it. Thank you very much from us. Thank you to an amazing panel of guests. And if you want to just come and hang out on Thursday, you're really welcome, but you might have had enough. Thank you very much indeed. Safe journeys home.